Hey guys, welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. And oh my god, we've been waiting a long time to look at F1 Fantasy again. But it's here, and let me tell you what I'm going to be going through in this video today. So, I'm going to look into the key price changes. I'm going to look into the key topics ahead of the Netherlands Grand Prix. I'm then going to be looking at Aston Martin versus McLaren, who you should pick. I'm going to look at who you should have as your second driver option. Same with the third and fourth driver and the fifth. Then I'm going to go on to if you need any chips this weekend. Potential wildcard maybe. And then I'll move on to the teams that you should pick for the Netherlands Grand Prix. And yes, I have every price range from 120 million down to 100 million, depending on how well you've done on the price changes. And hey, then I'll look at my team and my league. Make sure to follow my league. Join it, please. We've over 100 people in it now. Thank you all so much for joining it. And of course, follow my Twitter and please like and subscribe. So let's get straight into it. So first off, the key price changes are Perez dropping down 0.2 million, which is a shame but understandable as he didn't have the best weekend in Spa, getting only 8 points. But because he got the -20 from the sprint race, it did really negatively affect his final points tally at the end of the race weekend, which was not ideal, but at least he still got you some points. Then Norris, Stroll, Zhou, Gasly, Magnussen, Albon and Hulkenberg all went up 0.5 mil. Again, I've spoken about how crazy the price changes are in F1 Fantasy, especially Magnussen going up. His price is ridiculous, and Albon now almost as pricey as Piastri. Who's going to be picking Albon over Piastri? No idea. Magnussen's around 2.5 million more than his teammate Hulkenberg, and I know which one I'd pick. Then Esteban Ocon's gone up 1 million as well in the Alpine. Again, crazy ridiculous driver increase. Now I get he had a good race weekend at Spa, but Alpine really not the best team to bring in, especially for his price tag, and now that he's gone up 1 million, way too expensive. And then looking team wise, Aston, Alpine, Haas and Alpha all went up 0.5 mil. Again, Haas and Alpha, I don't see why they've gone up 0.5 mil. It's fair enough, but I don't think many people are bringing them in because you're not supposed to have those sorts of teams in your constructor slots. I understand Aston going up. Don't really understand Alpine. Again, I get they had a good race weekend, but they're not going to be doing that every race weekend. But anyway, that about wraps up the key price changes. There have been quite a few more, but they're not as key, you know, everyone has Verstappen and he's gone up 0.2 mil, that sort of bollocks. And now let's move on to the key topics. And of course, first up is Aston Martin versus McLaren. Now, these two teams, I have no idea who's going to be better after the summer break. My heart says McLaren, of course, but Aston by all means, and it has been reported that they could be back up there again. So it very much is 50-50. For me, if you either have Aston or McLaren, it's very good. When I look at the teams, you'll realise the variance is, if you can't afford to have McLaren in your team, just put Aston in there, because I believe they'll get similar points. So I don't think it's that deep. But for me, I'm going to stick with McLaren for now, just because of the last few races before summer. But maybe I might have to wildcard or change it back into Aston. But yeah, if you've got Aston or McLaren with the Red Bull in the constructors, you're fine. But for me, McLaren still is the better choice. But I'll be looking at practice very intently to see if Aston or McLaren are better, because I might be making some changes if Aston look better or McLaren look better. Then on to the second driver choice, and for me, first driver Verstappen, he's bang on. I don't need to talk about that. You have to have Verstappen in your team. We all know what he's doing this year. But with Perez, it's just disappointment after disappointment. And yes, if he didn't have the -20, he would have got 28 points in Spa. But he only managed 8, which is so frustrating for his price value. That's why he's dropped down. But I'm still saying it's too early to change to a Sainz, to a Russell, and Hamilton and Leclerc are just too expensive to be better options. So Perez still for me is the best second driver option that you should use, but let's just hope he can find some form, because my god, he is getting destroyed by Verstappen. Then moving on to the third and fourth driver, it's a bit weird here because there's 4 main drivers I'm going to be talking about constantly, which is Norris, Alonso, Piastri and Stroll. So just the 2 Aston and 2 McLaren boys. Now, realistically, it all comes down to how much money you've got in the bank. So if you can afford Norris and Alonso, go for it. But if you can't, maybe drop Norris to a Piastri and then you got Alonso and Piastri, or maybe drop Alonso to Stroll with Norris and Stroll. There's multiple people you can use for third and fourth choice, but I believe those 4 are the best. And no matter what sort of variance you have of those 4 drivers, you will do well with them in your team. And this 3rd and 4th choice does lead on to my 5th driver choice option as well, because it does affect that. Like for me, I will be getting Alonso into my team because I can now afford him, because Zhou's gone up in price and I've dropped down to Ricciardo as my 5th driver option. So the 5th driver option does come into play with the 3rd and 4th. And I think 3rd and 4th driver are very important. The 5th driver, not so much. Yes, you can drop down to a Hülkenberg and Ricciardo and it does not matter as much. But a Stroll to an Alonso, the difference is quite mad. Norris and Piastri, the difference isn't too much. Again, it's still better to have Norris over Piastri, but his price is just a little too high for me. Like usual, there are 4 driver options for me, which is Zhou Guanyu, Tsunoda, Hülkenberg and Ricciardo. Now, for me, Zhou is now too expensive as the 5th driver option, as he is worth 5.7 million, which is great for Zhou owners like myself. It means I can improve the rest of my team, like I said, as my 3rd or 4th driver pick. But I think if you were to bring him in now, it's just too expensive. And I think Ricciardo from this point onwards is going to get you just as many points. And because the 5th driver points maximum gets you 20-ish points maximum on a good race weekend, it doesn't matter as much, and you're going to get much better results if you have an Alonso and Ricciardo compared to a Stroll and a Zhou. So yeah, for me, Zhou is too expensive. Same with Tsunoda, he's 5.1 million at the minute, and it's not as bad as Zhou, but with Ricciardo coming in looking very decent, Ricciardo's 0.6 mil less, and I don't see the reason why you wouldn't go for him instead, because he has more chance to go up in value as well, because he hasn't reached his driver value roof. So it works out financially and points-wise to just go with Ricciardo. I think he's the favourite for me for 5th driver choice. But if you have any of those 4 drivers, you will be fine. Of course, you can bring in Hulk, but I'd say that as a last resort if you need that little bit more money just for a better drive. So then let's move on to any chips to be used on the weekend. Now for me, I think it's not the weekend to be using extra DRS or limitless. Now there's a reason for this, because no one really knows what's going to be happening between the Astons and McLarens, or will Red Bull be as dominant as they were in the first part of the season, Mercedes or Ferrari who's going to be faster, so no one really knows exactly where everyone stands. So I would say stay clear of the big boy chips for this weekend at least, especially because it's not a sprint race weekend also. But I would say wildcard is doable if in practice you see that you've got quite a few McLaren boys and Aston Martin look better, or vice versa with Aston looking worse and then you want to bring in the McLarens. But for me also, I think you can just take it with a pinch of salt for one race weekend and then use the wild card, because then say you do move too early with the wild card looking at practice results and then the practice isn't actually that spot on to how good everyone is, then you've just used your wild card and you've just wasted it. So I'd say if you do have Aston and McLaren look better, or do have McLaren and Aston look better, just wait until the end of the race weekend, take the result on the chin, and then wildcard. So now let's move on to the teams you can use this weekend. And now I've written out 8 teams you could use. Now the valuation of each team is very drastic, as I'm going from 120 million down to 100 million, so a team for everyone. And before I get into it, there are variances you can use. So obviously the teams I talk about, say you want to use one of the big boy teams that's 118 million, but you've only got 116 million. That means you can just move down from McLaren to Aston and then you've got the team. So you can do that sort of stuff to the teams. So the high costing team at 119.9 million would be Verstappen, Norris, Perez, Alonso, Ricciardo, and teams Red Bull and McLaren. Now, of course, Verstappen, Perez, like I've said, you need to have them in your team. Alonso and Norris are the best out of the Alonso, Norris, Piastri, Stroll movement. And Ricciardo, he's just cheap. He's going to get you the points, and I've already spoken about him before in this video. Again, Red Bull and McLaren as the teams, because I think they'll be the best teams going in to the Netherlands Grand Prix. But, of course, if you need a bit more money and you can't just afford it, drop down to the Astons. Or, again, drop down to Norris from Piastri, or Alonso to Stroll, which funnily enough actually is the 118 million team, which is Verstappen, Perez, Norris, Stroll and Ricciardo with Red Bull McLaren. Again, it's just dropping from Alonso to Stroll. And again, for the first medium costing team, which is 114.5 million, which is most likely the team I'm going to be using, as this is the team valuation I have at the minute, would be Verstappen, Perez, Alonso, Piastri, Ricciardo, Red Bull and McLaren. Again, just dropping Norris to Piastri, you're going to lose a few points, but not too drastic, and Piastri 9 million and Norris 14 odd million. It's just such a massive gap where you could be saving so much money, and Piastri is just going to get you as many points. Maybe a little less, still very good, and better than the drop from Alonso to Stroll. And again, talking about those variants I was talking about, the team for 112.7 million, which is the other medium cost team, is the same team as the 114.5 million team, just with Aston Martin instead. Again, just if you can't afford McLaren, go to Aston Martin. Now, moving on to the low-costing teams, at 110.4 million, you have Verstappen, Perez, Stroll, Piastri, Ricciardo, Red Bull and Aston. So again, Stroll, it's not ideal, but it's still a very good option compared to Gasly or Ocon. I wouldn't bring in the Alpines, or Albon or Magnussen. Piastri, again, I think he's so undervalued at the minute, and I don't know how he's still at 9 million considering Norris has gone up to 14 odd mil. So again, that's a great team to have. Then 107.6 million, you have the same team, but with Perez replaced with Sainz. Now again, like the variants, you could add Russell instead if you only need a little bit more. But basically, you just drop down from the Perez if you don't have enough money to play around with him. Because Perez, yes, he is ideal to have in your team, but a drop down to a Sainz, Russell or Norris isn't that crazy, and it saves you a lot of money. Then moving on to the final two cheap teams, and at 103.7 million you have Verstappen, Sainz, Piastri, Zhou, Ricciardo, Red Bull and Aston. Now again, if you need a little bit more money, you can drop Zhou to a Tsunoda or a Ricciardo, or drop Sainz to a Norris. And again, it'll be similar teams to that and you'll get similar points. But that is a pretty good team for a very low costing team. Now, for the one and only 100 million team, for anyone fresh starting, or if anyone's really just screwed up the price changes, you have Verstappen, Norris, Stroll, Ricciardo, Hülkenberg, Red Bull and Aston. So of course that drop from Perez to Norris, Alonso to Stroll, and then funnily enough you actually have the drop from Piastri to Ricciardo and Ricciardo to Hülkenberg. Again, Hülkenberg is a final last resort, but for 100 million, that is a pretty good team. Of course, there are massive improvements you could make to it, but for a starting team, that would increase your team valuation, and of course you have the main two things, Verstappen and Red Bull in that team. So I hope everyone likes those teams and can build upon those teams as you wish. Now moving on to how well I did last week, and like you can see, I used my extra DRS. I got 339 points. Now it wasn't ideal because I lost out on 30 points to Hamilton because he decided to go for the fastest lap, and I was fuming because I was like, surely Verstappen gets this, and then Hamilton went into the pits. But that's annoying, and of course Perez didn't get many points on my 2 times, which is frustrating, but it did get me up to the top 25k in the world, so I'm very happy with that at the minute. And the rest of my team did alright, looking good into the Netherlands Grand Prix. Like I said, I'll probably be upgrading Stroll to Alonso and downgrading Zhou to Ricciardo because of the price increase from Zhou. But yeah, 34th in my own league as well. I'm very happy with where I am at the minute. And of course, if you want to join my league, link in the description, and I'll show the link right on the screen now. But hey, that about sums up this video. I hope you had a great time watching it, and I hope it helps you for the Dutch Grand Prix this weekend. I will see you next week. Bye bye.